The first thing I noticed about Port Blossom was the scent. It was a complicated perfume of salt, diesel, and wet decay, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and promises either adventure or a deep, lingering dampness. For me, it mostly promised the latter. My cottage, a glorified shed with delusions of grandeur and a view of the perpetually gray water, smelled of old wood and the ghosts of fishermen past. It was perfect. It was a place where loneliness could feel intentional, artistic even, rather than the pathetic, sprawling accident it had become back in the city. I was a writer, which is a polite way of saying I was an expert in procrastination and observation. My second novel was dying a slow death on my laptop, and I'd come here under the pretense of resuscitating it. The truth was, I was running. Running from the silent apartment, the sympathetic and slightly pitying looks from my friends, the crushing weight of a life that felt like a poorly fitted suit. Here, the gray sky and the ceaseless sigh of the waves felt like a kindred spirit. Misery loves company, and the Pacific Northwest in late autumn was as miserable a companion as one could hope for. For 3 days, I did nothing but stare out the window, drink bitter coffee, and watch the tide chew at the rotting pylons of my private dock. The dock was a joke, a few planks of wood clinging precariously to the shore, but it was my joke. My landlord, a cheerfully round woman named Carol, had mentioned it with pride. Best view for the morning fog, she'd said. She had failed to mention that the fog never really left, and the dock looked one strong gust away from becoming driftwood. On the 4th day, the wind picked up. The radio, a crackling relic in the cottage's kitchen, spoke of a storm front moving in. Carol called, her voice tinny over the bad connection. "You'll want to double-tie everything, honey. That little dock of yours, especially. The lines are probably rotten. Best to get some new rope down at the marina." I had no idea what double-tie meant. My experience with knots was limited to my shoelaces, and even that was a 50-50 proposition some mornings. But the thought of my dock being torn away felt like a personal failure, another thing I couldn't hold on to. So I pulled on a waterproof jacket that wasn't, and headed towards the sound of gulls and boat engines. The main dock was a different world from my quiet, decaying corner of the cove. It was a working place, alive with the thrum of engines and the shouts of men in heavy boots. The air was thicker here, stinging with the smell of fish and brine. I felt immediately out of place, a tourist in a land of competence. My jacket was too clean, my boots too new. I hovered near the chandlery, trying to work up the courage to go in and ask for rope, like an idiot who'd never seen the sea before. That's when I saw him. He was on the deck of a fishing trawler named the Sea Serpent, a name far too dramatic for the vessel's rusty, hard-working demeanor. He wasn't coiling a rope, he was taming it. His hands, gloveless and stained, moved with an unthinking economy. There was no wasted motion. He was a man who knew the language of tension and slack. He was tall, built with the dense, practical muscle that comes from years of physical labor, not from a gym. His hair was dark and shorn close to his head, and his face was all angles, carved by wind and concentration. He wasn't handsome in the polished way I was used to from the city. He was something more elemental, more real. He was a part of the landscape, as fixed and weathered as the barnacled pylons he worked beside. I stood there, a fool in a flimsy jacket, watching him. He seemed completely contained within his own world, a bubble of quiet focus in the midst of the dockside chaos. He finished with the rope, laying it in a perfect, concentric circle on the deck, and then he looked up. His eyes scanned the dock, a quick, sweeping glance that took in everything and nothing. And then, for a fraction of a second, they landed on me. They were gray, the color of the water just before the storm hits. There was no judgment in them, no curiosity, just a flat, steady assessment. I felt pinned by that look seen. I quickly looked away, my face hot, and fumbled with the zipper on my jacket. I felt like an insect under glass. When I dared to look back, he was gone, vanished into the cabin of the boat. The space where he had stood seemed suddenly empty, less vibrant. Shaking off the strange intensity of the moment, I finally forced myself into the chandlery. The store was a chaotic wonderland of brass fittings, nautical charts, and rope of every conceivable thickness. A bell jingled. The man behind the counter was old, with a beard that seemed to contain crumbs from several decades. "Help you?" he grunted. I need rope." I said, my voice sounding thin and ridiculous. For a dock. A small 1 inch. He chewed on a toothpick, sizing me up. What kind of tie you needin'? I blinked. A strong one? For the storm. He sighed. A long, weary sound, and heaved himself off his stool. He led me to a wall of coiled ropes, the air thick with the smell of hemp and tar. He pointed. This'll do. How much you need? I had no idea. I thought of my sad little dock and shrugged. 20 feet. He gave me a look that clearly communicated my profound ignorance. 30. At least. You from the cottage at Miller's Cove? I nodded, surprised. Thought so. That dock's a piece of work. You'll want to tie off on the old iron cleat, not the wooden post. Post rotten. He measured and cut the rope with a heavy knife, his movements slow but precise. I paid him, the thick, coarse rope feeling alien and heavy in my hands. Back outside, the wind was colder, carrying the first hints of rain. I walked back to my cottage, the rope slung over my shoulder, feeling marginally more prepared and infinitely more foolish. The task ahead seemed insurmountable. I stood on the slick, wobbling planks, staring at the old iron cleat the man had mentioned. It was rusted and formidable. I had the tool, the rope, but I had no knowledge of how to use it. I tried to loop it, to twist it, to create something that looked like a knot I'd once seen in a movie. The rope was stiff and uncooperative. The wind whipped a loose end into my face, and a cold drizzle began to fall. It was hopeless. I was a fraud, a city boy playing at being rustic, and the sea was about to call my bluff. I was about to give up, to retreat inside and let nature take its course, when a low voice spoke from behind me, startling me so badly I nearly slipped off the edge. You'll lose it that way. I turned, my heart hammering. It was him, the man from the boat. He was standing on the shore, his hands in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket. He looked even taller up close. His gray eyes were fixed on the mess of rope in my hands. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, the confession feeling both humiliating and like a relief. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth ticked up slightly. It wasn't a gesture of mockery, but of acknowledgement. He walked onto the dock, his heavy boots sure-footed on the wet wood that had felt so treacherous beneath my own feet. He moved without the slightest hesitation. The dock didn't even seem to sway under his weight. He came to a stop just in front of me, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of salt and clean, cold air on him. He held out a hand. Rope. It was a command, not a request. I handed it over. He took it from me, his calloused fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a spark of warmth through my cold skin. I watched his hands as he worked. They moved with the same fluid certainty I had admired from afar. He looped the rope around the iron cleat, his fingers twisting and pulling, creating a complex, beautiful knot in seconds. It was a perfect figure eight, tight and secure. He pulled on it, testing its strength against his own considerable weight. It didn't budge. There, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the wood beneath us. That'll hold. He turned his attention to the other end of the dock. There was no second cleat, only the rotten wooden post the chandlery owner had warned me about. He frowned, his gaze assessing the situation. He looked at the post, then at the base of the dock where it met the rocky shore, then at me. I felt like a problem he was solving. He took the remaining length of rope and walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine. He didn't seem to notice. I noticed. I noticed the solid warmth of him, the rough texture of his jacket, the way the whole world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact. He looped the rope around a thick, gnarled root of an old cedar tree that grew at the edge of my small lawn, its base firmly embedded in the earth. He pulled it taut, then walked back towards me on the dock. Now we were standing close. Too close. The dock was narrow, and the wind was pushing the rain sideways. He was holding the rope, pulling the slack from it, bringing my little dock into a new, unyielding tension against the shore. He looked from the rope in his hand to my chest, as if I were part of the equation. He took my rope, the rope I had bought, the rope that represented my incompetence, and he pulled me in against him. Not roughly, but with a firm, deliberate pressure. My hands came up against the solid wall of his chest. I could feel the steady beat of his heart through the layers of his clothes. My breath caught in my throat. He was so warm. The world outside the circle of his arms, the wind, the rain, the angry gray water, seemed to fade away. His gray eyes met mine. They were impossible to read. He held my gaze for a long moment, and then he spoke, his voice low and close to my ear. "You need to tie off with me." Close. He wasn't talking about the rope anymore. Or maybe he was. Maybe he was talking about all of it. He shifted slightly, his body a solid anchor against the rising storm, and began to work the final knot, his arms around me, his hands moving with that same mesmerizing efficiency. And I just stood there, trapped and perfectly, terrifyingly secure. The days that followed were a study in obsession. The storm came and went, a blustering tantrum of wind and rain that did little more than wash the world clean. My dock, thanks to him, held fast. I never got his name. After he'd finished the knot, his arms moving around me in a way that felt both impersonal and deeply intimate, he had simply nodded once and left. I'd stood there in the rain for a long time, the ghost of his warmth on my skin, the echo of his words, "Tie off with me," close, replaying in my head. I began to structure my days around the possibility of seeing him. It was pathetic, I knew that. I was supposed to be writing a novel about complex human emotions, and here I was, reduced to a teenager with a crush. I'd take my laptop to the Salty Siren, the only coffee shop in town with a decent view of the marina. I'd order a black coffee I wouldn't drink and position myself at the window seat, pretending to be lost in thought, while my entire consciousness was focused on the docks below. I learned his rhythm. He arrived before the sun, a dark shape moving through the pre-dawn mist. He worked on the Sea Serpent, mending nets, cleaning decks, loading crates. There was a quiet dignity to his labor. He rarely spoke to the other men, but they seemed to respect him. They'd clap him on the shoulder, and he'd give that small, almost imperceptible nod in return. He was a man who communicated in gestures, in actions. Words were an unnecessary extravagance. My writing suffered, or perhaps it transformed. My protagonist, a jaded architect navigating a midlife crisis, suddenly developed an interest in nautical knots. My descriptions of cityscapes gave way to long, rambling passages about the color of the sea and the way light hit the water. My journal, however, flourished. It became a logbook of his movements. 8:17 a.m. He's wearing a dark gray beanie. The color matches his eyes. He's drinking coffee from a metal thermos. I wonder if he makes it himself. Does he take sugar? 11:42 a.m. A tourist asked him for directions. He didn't smile, just pointed. He seems to have no time for pleasantries. I find this incredibly compelling. Is there something wrong with me? 3:05 p.m. He lifted a crate of fish that must have weighed 100 pounds. His bicep flexed under his flannel shirt. I had to close my laptop and pretend to stretch to hide the fact that I was staring. I think I need to get a hobby. This was my new hobby. I learned his name was Finn. I heard one of the other fishermen shouted across the water. Finn. It suited him. It was a name that sounded like a stone skipping across water, short, solid, and with a sense of depth beneath it. One afternoon, driven by a particularly acute bout of writer's block and a desperate need for human interaction that didn't involve a fictional character, I decided to take a walk along the docks. I told myself it was for research. I was gathering atmosphere. I was a professional. It was a lie, of course. I was a moth, and he was a dim, distant, and utterly captivating light bulb. He was there, mending a large, tangled net that was spread across the dock. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his large hands surprisingly nimble as they worked a wooden shuttle through the mesh. I slowed my pace as I approached, my heart starting a nervous, stupid rhythm against my ribs. I needed to say something. Thank you. That was it. Simple. Polite. Normal. Hi, I said. My voice came out as a squeak. Finn didn't look up immediately. He finished the knot he was working on, pulling it tight with a practiced jerk of his wrist. Then, slowly, he raised his head. Those gray eyes landed on me again. There was a flicker of something in them. Recognition. Your dock hold, he asked. His voice was just as low as I remembered, a gravelly sound that I felt more than heard. Yes, perfectly. Thank you. I never got a chance to properly thank you. No need, he said, his gaze dropping back to the net. It was a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. My face burned. I had been foolish to think he would want to talk. He was a man of action, of work. I was a man of useless words and awkward pauses. I should have walked away. I should have taken the hint and retreated to my cottage to write another 100 words of self-pitying prose. But I was stuck. My feet felt nailed to the weathered planks. That's a big net, I said, wincing internally at my own brilliance. He pulled a section of the net taut, inspecting it. It's a purse seine, right? Of course, I had no idea what a purse seine was. For fishing. For the first time, I saw the corner of his mouth twitch in what might have been amusement. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. Mostly, he said, his tone dry. An awkward silence descended, broken only by the cry of a gull and the gentle lapping of water against the pylons. I was making a fool of myself. I knew it. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Being near him, even in this excruciatingly stilted conversation, was better than being alone in my cottage, staring at a blank screen. He must have sensed my pathetic desperation. He sighed, a barely audible sound, and set down his shuttle. He looked at me again, really looked at me this time. His gaze was intense, analytical. He was taking me apart and putting me back together, trying to figure out what I was. "You're the writer," he stated. It wasn't a question. My stomach did a nervous flip. "How did you know?" "Carol talks," he said, a simple explanation that covered the entirety of small-town life. "Says you're writing a book." "Trying to," I corrected. "It's not going well." The admission slipped out before I could stop it. It was too honest, too vulnerable. He considered this for a moment. He picked up his shuttle again, but he didn't resume his work. He just held it, turning it over and over in his hands. "What's it about?" I was so surprised by the question that I stammered. "Oh, it's about a man who feels disconnected. From his life. His work. He's looking for something authentic." I trailed off, realizing I was basically just describing myself. Finn nodded slowly, his eyes on the horizon. Lots of that going around. And that was it. That was the extent of our second conversation. But it felt like a monumental breakthrough. He had asked me a question. He had acknowledged my existence beyond my faulty dock. I walked back to my cottage feeling ridiculously buoyant. A single, cryptic sentence, lots of that going around, turning over and over in my mind. Did he mean he felt that way too? Was it a general observation on the human condition? Or was it just a polite way to end a conversation with a weird stranger who was staring at him while he worked? My internal analysis machine went into overdrive. I spent the rest of the day dissecting every word, every gesture. The way he'd held the shuttle. The brief, fleeting hint of a smile. The way his gaze had lingered for a second too long. I was building a novel's worth of subtext out of a 30-second interaction. A few days later, the meaningful touches began. They were small things, probably meaningless, but to my starved and over-analytical mind, they were seismic events. The first happened outside the town's only grocery store. I was fumbling with 2 overflowing paper bags, trying to unlock my car, when one of the bags ripped. An apple, followed by an onion, then a cascade of potatoes, rolled across the wet pavement. I swore under my breath and knelt down, a fresh wave of humiliation washing over me. Of course this would happen. A pair of heavy work boots entered my field of vision. "Need a hand." It was Finn. He was there, squatting down beside me before I could even reply, his large hands gathering the escaped produce with an easy competence. He picked up the last potato and dropped it into the one remaining intact bag. "Thanks," I mumbled, my face flushed. "I'm a disaster today." "Just groceries," he said, as if to reassure me it wasn't a moral failing. He took the heavy, intact bag from me. "I'll get this." He carried it to my car, waiting patiently as I finally managed to unlock the door. He placed the bag in the passenger seat, then came back for the second, now half-empty, bag I was clutching. As I handed it to him, our fingers brushed. It was nothing, a fleeting, incidental contact. But his skin was warm and rough against mine. The touch was electric, a tiny jolt of lightning that shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He put the second bag in the car, closed the door, and gave a short nod. "Drive safe," he said, and walked away. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, my fingers tingling, replaying that single, stupid moment. The brush of his skin against mine. It was the first time anyone had touched me with even accidental kindness in months. I drove home in a daze, the smell of his clean, salt and soap scent seeming to linger in my car. I analyzed that touch for 2 days. The second touch was more deliberate. Another weather front was moving in, less a storm and more a persistent, angry drizzle. I was on my dock, checking his knots. They were still perfect, unyielding. I was just standing there, staring at the gray churn of the water, when I heard his footsteps behind me. "Still holding," he said, his voice close. I turned. He was standing there, a thermos in his hand. "Your work is good," I said. He gave a slight shrug, as if it were nothing. He looked out at the water, then at me. "Carol's worried about your chimney flue. Says it gets blocked in this kind of wind." I hadn't even thought about it, I admitted. "I'll take a look," he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact. He brushed past me to get to the side of the cottage where the flue ran up the wall. As he passed, he placed a hand on my shoulder to steady himself on the narrow dock. The gesture was practical, brief. But his hand was heavy and warm, and it stayed there for a second longer than was strictly necessary. I could feel the strength in his grip, a solid, anchoring pressure that made my knees feel weak. I stopped breathing. The world narrowed to the feeling of his palm on my shoulder. Then he was gone, moving towards the cottage, leaving me with the ghost of his touch and a wildly galloping heart. He checked the flue, pronounced it clear, and was gone again, all in the space of 5 minutes. He left me reeling, a mess of confusion and burgeoning hope. These were just small things. The actions of a helpful neighbor in a small town. They had to be. But my gut, my writer's instinct for subtext, told me otherwise. It told me that something was happening, something quiet and slow and terrifyingly real. The third touch happened at the Rusty Anchor, the town's only pub. On Friday nights, it was packed with fishermen and locals, the air thick with the smell of beer and fried fish. I had gone against my better judgment, craving a change of scenery from my own four walls. The place was a loud, overwhelming assault on the senses. I felt like a ghost, invisible and out of place, clutching a beer at the edge of the crowd. I saw him across the room. He was with a few other men from the docks, but he was on the periphery of their loud conversation, nursing a single beer, watching the room with those observant gray eyes. Our eyes met for a moment across the sea of bodies. I gave a small, awkward wave. He gave a slow nod in return. Later, I was trying to push my way through the throng to get to the bar for another drink. I was being jostled and shoved, an island of awkwardness in a sea of boisterous camaraderie. Suddenly, a solid presence was behind me. A warm hand settled on the small of my back. "Let me," Finn's voice rumbled near my ear. I froze. His hand was a brand, a circle of heat just above my belt. It was a gesture I'd seen men use with their partners 1,000 times, a casual, proprietary touch that said, "You're with me." He didn't push me. He simply guided me, his body a shield against the crowd, his hand a steady, unwavering pressure on my back. He cleared a path for me, as if by magic. People just seemed to move out of his way. We reached the bar. He ordered 2 beers without asking what I wanted, placing the money on the wet counter. His hand didn't leave my back. I was hyper-aware of it, of every finger, of the warmth seeping through my shirt. My skin was on fire. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe properly. He handed me a beer, our fingers brushing again. This time, I didn't pull away. "Thanks," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "It gets loud in here," was all he said, as if that explained everything. He leaned against the bar beside me, creating a small, protected space for us in the chaos. His arm was pressed against mine. We stood there for a long time, drinking our beers in silence, while the noise of the pub raged around us. It was the most comfortable and the most intensely charged silence I had ever experienced. His hand was gone from my back, but I could still feel it there, a phantom touch that was more real than anything else in the room. I knew, with a certainty that terrified and thrilled me, that this was no longer just in my head. The great storm, the one the radio had been muttering about for days, finally decided to make its grand entrance on a Tuesday night. It arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, ominous darkening of the sky and a wind that moaned like a dying animal around the eaves of my little cottage. The rain started as a whisper, then became a roar, lashing against the windows in horizontal sheets. The world beyond my glass panes dissolved into a churning gray chaos. I was trying to work, but it was impossible. The flickering lights made the words on my screen dance and swim. The power was threatening to quit, and the entire cottage seemed to tremble with each powerful gust of wind. I made a cup of tea, my hands shaking slightly, and stared out at the cove. The waves were monsters, black and white-capped, crashing over the rocks and sending spray halfway up my lawn. My dock was completely submerged, then would reappear, slick and defiant, before being swallowed again. Finn's knots were holding. The thought was a small, solid comfort in the midst of the gale. Then, with a final, apologetic flicker, the lights went out. The hum of the refrigerator died. The only sounds left were the fury of the storm and the frantic, useless beating of my own heart. The darkness was absolute, a thick, pressing velvet. I fumbled for my phone, its small screen a pathetic beacon in the gloom. I had no candles, no flashlight. I was, once again, completely and utterly unprepared. Fear, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my composure. I was alone, in a flimsy wooden box, at the mercy of a raging sea. I was trying to remember a single useful survival skill from a lifetime of watching movies when a sudden, heavy banging on the door made me jump so violently I dropped my phone. It clattered to the floor, its light extinguished. My heart leaped into my throat. Who could possibly be out in this? "Hello," I called out, my voice thin and trembling. "Elias, open the door." "Finn." Relief washed over me so intensely it made me dizzy. I stumbled through the darkness, my hands outstretched, until I found the doorknob. I wrenched it open. He was standing on my small porch, a figure carved from the storm itself. He was drenched, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, rain streaming down his face. In one hand, he held an old-fashioned oil lantern, its warm, steady glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. It cast long, dancing shadows across his face, making his features seem even more stark and elemental. "Power's out all along the cove," he said, his voice easily carrying over the wind. "My place has a generator. You're coming with me." It was not a question. It was a command, delivered with the same quiet authority he used for everything. He stepped inside, bringing the light and the smell of the storm with him. He didn't wait for my agreement. He was already scanning my small living room, his gaze practical and assessing. "Get your coat," he said, "and your laptop. Anything you don't want ruined if the roof decides to leak." I was too stunned to argue. I moved on autopilot, gathering my things with clumsy, fumbling hands. He waited by the door, a silent, solid anchor in the chaos of my unlit cottage. The lantern light illuminated the concern etched around his eyes, a subtle tension in his jaw that I hadn't seen before. He was worried. For me, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The journey to his cabin was a battle. The wind tore at us, trying to rip the very air from our lungs. Finn walked in front, his broad back a shield, one hand holding the lantern high, the other gripping my arm in a hold that was both bruising and reassuring. His cabin was further down the cove, tucked into a grove of ancient cedars that offered some protection from the gale. It was small and Spartan, built of dark, weathered wood. It looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. Inside, the difference was immediate. A generator hummed somewhere outside, and two simple lamps cast a warm, steady light. A small wood stove in the corner radiated a blissful heat. The cabin was one room, meticulously organized. Books were stacked neatly on shelves, tools hung from pegs on the wall, and a simple kitchen was tucked into one corner. It was the space of a man who owned little but took care of what he had. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something that was just. "Finn, you can put your things there," he said, pointing to a small wooden table. He was already stripping off his wet jacket, his movements efficient. "I'll make some coffee." I felt shy, an intruder in his sanctuary. I put my bag down and took off my own soaked coat, suddenly aware of how out of place my city clothes looked in this rustic, self-sufficient space. He handed me a thick, dry towel. "Thanks," I said, rubbing it over my hair. He just nodded, busy with a percolator on the camp stove he'd set up on his counter. We worked in a comfortable, cooperative silence for a while. A shutter on one of the windows was banging relentlessly, and he went outside into the storm again to fix it, handing me a hammer and nails through the open window, my hands holding them steady for him as he worked in the lashing rain. We didn't need to speak. I knew where to hold the light. He knew how to secure the wood. It felt natural, easy. When he came back inside, soaked for a second time, He stripped off his wet flannel shirt without a second thought, revealing a gray t-shirt underneath that clung to the hard muscles of his chest and shoulders. He toweled his hair dry, oblivious to the fact that I was trying very hard not to stare. The domesticity of the moment was unnerving and yet deeply comforting. We were two people, sealed in a warm, bright space, while the world raged outside. Later, we sat at the small table, drinking coffee that was strong enough to dissolve a spoon. The storm was a constant, dull roar in the background. The initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by a quiet intimacy born of shared crisis. "So," he said, his hands wrapped around his heavy ceramic mug. "This authentic thing you're writing about. You find any of it yet?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, it caught me off guard. He was referring to our conversation on the dock, days ago. He remembered. "I'm not sure," I answered honestly, looking down at my own mug. "I think maybe I don't know what it looks like." He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes watching me over the rim of his cup. His gaze was steady, unsettlingly perceptive. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "it's just about holding on in a storm." The simplicity of it, the truth of it, struck me. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I felt like he wasn't just observing me, but that he was seeing me. All my fear, my loneliness, my desperate search for meaning. He saw it, and he wasn't judging it. He was just acknowledging it. I found myself telling him about the book, about the city, about the feeling of being an imposter in my own life. The words just poured out of me, encouraged by his quiet, non-judgmental presence. He was a phenomenal listener. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer easy platitudes. He just listened, his head tilted slightly, his full attention on me. It was a gift, a profound act of generosity. When I finally fell silent, feeling exposed and raw, he didn't try to fill the quiet. He just let it sit there, comfortably, between us. Then, he offered a piece of himself in return. "My grandfather built this cabin," he said, his voice soft, his gaze drifting towards the dark wood of the walls. "He taught me how to read the water, how to tie knots that hold. He used to say a man's worth could be measured by the reliability of his knots." He looked down at his own hands, calloused and capable. He didn't have much time for things that weren't real, things that didn't work. It was the most he had ever said to me at one time. It was a glimpse into the heart of him, into the code he lived by. Reliability, strength, authenticity. He was everything my character, everything I was searching for. The realization was so overwhelming, so potent, that I had to look away. As the night wore on, the storm began to tire itself out. The wind died down to a mournful whistle, and the rain softened to a steady drumming on the roof. An exhausted peace settled over the cabin. Yawning, Finn stood up and stretched, his back cracking. "You can take the bed," he said, gesturing to a simple bed frame in the corner with a thick quilt folded on it. "I'll take the couch." "Finn, no, I can't. This is your house." "It's a bad couch," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "And I'm the host. You take the bed." There was no arguing with him. While he arranged some blankets on the small, worn sofa, I went to the bed. It was comfortable, the sheets smelling faintly of cedar and clean laundry. He turned off the main lamps, leaving only the soft glow from the wood stove. The cabin was filled with warmth and flickering shadows. "Good night, Elias." His voice came from the darkness. "Good night, Finn," I whispered back. "And thank you for everything." There was a pause, and then his voice, low and rough with sleepiness. "Just holding on in a storm." I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of his steady breathing from across the room and the gentle patter of the rain on the roof. The fear was gone, replaced by a feeling I couldn't name. It was a profound sense of safety, of being cared for, of not being alone. I was in a stranger's bed, in a town I barely knew, in the middle of a storm, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. In the calm after the storm, a new kind of tension settled between us. The world outside Finn's cabin was washed clean, glistening and bright under a tentative sun. The air was crisp, smelling of wet earth and pine. But inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken things. We had weathered a storm together, shared a space, shared confessions. The comfortable distance of strangers had been eroded, and neither of us seemed to know what to replace it with. We made breakfast in a state of mutual, awkward politeness. We moved around each other in the small kitchen, our bodies careful not to touch, our words limited to coffee, and past the salt, the easy intimacy of the night before had vanished with the darkness, leaving a self-conscious silence in its wake. I felt him watching me when my back was turned, and I knew I was doing the same to him. The air crackled with a low-grade hum of awareness. After breakfast, he drove me back to my cottage. The ride was silent, the truck smelling of him, a scent that was now achingly familiar. When we pulled up, we both saw the damage. A large branch from the old cedar tree had fallen, narrowly missing my roof, but crushing a section of my porch railing. "Damn it," Finn muttered, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He was out of the truck before I could say anything, his body all action and purpose. He inspected the damage, his face set in a grim line. "It's not so bad," I said, trying to sound unconcerned. "The cottage is fine. The railing's gone. It's not safe." He was already walking towards the back of his truck, pulling out a chainsaw and an axe. "I'll clear it." And so he spent the morning at my cottage, a whirlwind of focused energy. I watched from the doorway as he expertly sectioned the massive branch with the chainsaw, the roar of the engine filling the quiet cove. He worked with a physical grace that was mesmerizing, the muscles in his back and arms cording with effort. I offered to help, but he just shook his head and pointed me towards the smaller branches, tasking me with dragging them to a pile for kindling. It felt good to work, to do something physical and useful beside him. We fell into a rhythm, the roar of his saw and the snap of the branches I broke forming a kind of work song. The town, eager to celebrate its resilience after the storm, organized a bonfire on the beach for that evening. Carol stopped by to check on me and invited me, her eyes darting knowingly between me and Finn, who was now hammering a temporary railing into place on my porch. "You should both come," she said, her voice laden with unsubtle meaning. I felt a blush creep up my neck. "Maybe," I mumbled. That evening, I almost didn't go. The thought of navigating a social event, of trying to act normal around Finn after the charged intimacy of the previous night, was exhausting. But the thought of sitting alone in my cottage was worse. So I went. The beach was beautiful, lit by a huge, roaring bonfire that sent sparks dancing into the darkening sky. Half the town was there, their faces ruddy and cheerful in the firelight. I saw Finn standing near the edge of the crowd, a bottle of beer in his hand, talking to the old man from the chandlery. He saw me arrive and gave me that characteristic short nod, but he didn't come over. A knot of disappointment tightened in my stomach. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the storm had been a strange fever dream. I was trying to look casual, leaning against a piece of driftwood and nursing my own beer, when a man I vaguely recognized from the grocery store approached me. His name was Dale, and he had the smug, entitled air of a man who had never been told no in his life. "You're the city fella, right?" he said, his voice a little too loud. "Renting Carol's place." "That's me," I said, forcing a smile. "Still here alone?" he asked, looking me up and down. "Figured your girlfriend would have come out to join you by now. Must get lonely out here for a guy like you." The insinuation was clear, coated in a thin veneer of friendly concern. "A guy like you." The phrase hung in the air, weighted with judgment. My face grew hot. I never knew how to handle this kind of passive-aggressive bigotry. My throat closed up, my usual arsenal of witty comebacks completely deserting me. I was stammering, trying to form a reply that was neither aggressive nor weak, when a shadow fell over us. It was Finn. He had moved so silently I hadn't even seen him approach. He came to stand beside me, so close our shoulders were touching. He didn't look at Dale. He looked out at the fire, his expression unreadable. "He's not waiting for anyone," Finn said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it had the flat, hard finality of a door slamming shut. It cut through Dale's smarmy tone like a knife. Dale blinked, his bravado deflating. He looked from Finn's stony profile to my stunned face and back again. Finn still hadn't looked at him, but the sheer force of his presence, the quiet, unshakable solidarity of it, was more intimidating than any threat. Dale mumbled something about getting another beer and beat a hasty retreat. I stood there, trembling slightly. My heart was pounding. Finn had defended me. He had stood with me, for me. He had drawn a line in the sand without raising his voice or making a scene. He had simply claimed the space beside me as his own. He took a slow drink of his beer, still looking at the fire. The silence stretched, filled with the crackle of the flames and the roar of the surf. "Thank you," I finally managed to whisper, my voice thick. He turned his head then, and his gray eyes met mine in the flickering firelight. "There's nothing to thank me for," he said. But his eyes said something different. They were dark and intense, and they held a question. We left the bonfire not long after that, walking side by side along the water's edge, away from the noise and the light. The moon was a silver sliver in the inky sky, and the sand was cool beneath our feet. The air was thick with everything we weren't saying. The comfortable silence we had shared before was gone, replaced by a humming, vibrating tension that seemed to connect our bodies even though we weren't touching. I was the one who broke it. I had to know. I couldn't spend another minute dissecting and analyzing. I needed something real. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the waves. "Back there. With Dale." Finn stopped walking. I stopped a few feet past him and turned to face him. His face was in shadow, his expression impossible to decipher. He didn't answer my question. Instead, after a long, taut pause, he asked one of his own. "What did you want it to be?" The question hung between us, a direct, terrifying challenge. He was turning it back on me, forcing me to name the thing that had been growing between us in the silences and the small touches. He was asking me to be brave, to be honest. My mind raced. I could deflect. I could make a joke, pretend I didn't understand the implication. I could retreat back into the safety of my shell, back to my lonely cottage and my lonely life. But I was so tired of being lonely. I looked at him, at this quiet, steady man who fixed my dock and shielded me from storms and stood up for me without being asked. This man who saw the real me and wasn't scared away. And a wave of feeling, so powerful and so overwhelming it felt like one of the storm's breakers, crashed over me. All the fear, all the hesitation, was washed away. All that was left was the raw, terrifying truth. "I don't know what I wanted it to be," I said, my voice shaking but clear in the quiet night. "I just know. I can't stop thinking about you. Ever since I got here. Ever since that first day on the dock." The words were out. They hung in the cold, salty air, fragile and exposed. I had laid myself bare. I had handed him my heart, and I fully expected him to turn and walk away, to leave me alone on the beach with my foolish, reckless confession. I braced myself for the rejection, for the quiet retreat into himself that I had seen him use with others. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he closed the small distance between us in 2 silent steps. The world seemed to hold its breath. He reached out, his hand coming up to cup my jaw. His thumb, rough and calloused, stroked gently across my cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated feeling that traveled through every nerve in my body. His eyes, dark and serious in the moonlight, searched mine. "Good," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper that was nearly stolen by the wind. "Because I haven't been able to think about anything else either." And then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative kiss or a questioning one. It was a kiss of absolute certainty. It was slow and deep and sure, a release of all the pent-up tension, all the longing glances, all the unspoken words that had been arcing between us for weeks. His lips were firm and tasted of beer and salt and the smoky air from the bonfire. He wasn't asking, he was answering. He was telling me, in the only language that he truly trusted, that he felt it too. My hands came up to grip his arms, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. He pulled me closer, one hand moving from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. The other arm wrapped around my waist, holding me flush against the solid warmth of his body. It was a kiss that was both a beginning and an end. The end of my loneliness, the end of my fear, and the beginning of everything. When he finally, slowly, pulled away, he rested his forehead against mine. We stood there for a long time, breathing the same air, the sound of the waves a gentle rhythm beneath the frantic beating of our hearts. "Tie off with me," I whispered, the words he had said to me on that first day, now filled with a new, profound meaning. I felt his lips curve into a smile against my skin. "Close," he murmured back. And he was closer than anyone had ever been. The walk back to my cottage was a dream. We walked with our hands entwined, a simple, profound connection that felt more real than anything I had ever known. We didn't speak. There were no words for the magnitude of what had just happened, for the seismic shift that had occurred in both our universes. The silence wasn't awkward or tense anymore. It was full and rich, a comfortable blanket woven from shared understanding. Inside my little cottage, the air was still and cool. Finn closed the door behind us, shutting out the rest of the world. There was just us. My heart picked up its pace again, a nervous, excited flutter. What now? The kiss had answered the big question, but 1,000 smaller ones were now buzzing in my head. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the soft light from the one lamp I'd left on. He looked uncertain for the first time all night, his usual quiet confidence replaced by a vulnerability that mirrored my own. It was startling and deeply endearing. He, the man of action and certainty, was just as adrift in this new territory as I was. He took a step towards me, then hesitated. I closed the distance myself, rising up on my toes to press a soft, questioning kiss to his lips. He responded instantly, a low sound rumbling in his chest as he wrapped his arms around me again, pulling me tight against him. This kiss was different from the one on the beach. It was less about catharsis and more about discovery. It was a slow, gentle exploration, a mapping of new terrain. We ended up in my bedroom, a small, simple room with a window that looked out onto the dark water. Our clothes came off slowly, with fumbling, eager hands. It wasn't a frenzied, desperate act. It was deliberate, almost reverent. Every touch was a question, every glance an answer. Seeing him in the dim light, the strong, beautiful lines of his body, felt like a privilege. He moved with that same economy I'd admired on the docks, but now it was for me. His hands on my skin were both rough and gentle, calloused from work, but infinitely careful. He explored my body as if he were reading a chart, memorizing every line and contour. There was an awkwardness, a fumbling that was almost comical, but it wasn't embarrassing. It was human. It was real. It was two people, new to each other, trying to find a rhythm. And we did. We found it in the quiet sighs, in the press of skin against skin, in the steady, anchoring weight of his body over mine. It was less about passion and more about a profound, desperate need for closeness. It was about erasing the space between us, about holding on in the quiet after the storm. It was about feeling, finally, not alone. Afterward, we lay tangled together in my narrow bed, the sound of the waves a gentle lullaby outside the window. His arm was a heavy, warm weight over my waist, his face buried in my hair, his breathing slow and even. I had never felt so safe, so completely and utterly content. I drifted off to sleep wrapped in the scent of him, the feeling of his solid presence a bulwark against all the fears and anxieties that usually plagued my nights. I woke to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through the window. For a moment, I was disoriented, a blissful, sleepy haze clouding my mind. Then memory rushed back in, and I smiled, turning my head to look at Finn. The space beside me was empty. Panic, cold and immediate, seized me. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow next to me. The blanket was thrown back on his side of the bed. But he was gone. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. I looked in the small living room, the kitchen. Empty. His jacket was gone from the hook by the door. His boots were gone. He had left. He had left without a word, without a note, slipping away in the pre-dawn darkness like a thief. The beautiful, fragile reality of the night before shattered into a million pieces. My mind, my worst enemy, went into overdrive. He regretted it. Of course he regretted it. It was a mistake, a moment of bonfire-induced madness. He was a quiet, private man, and I had pushed him, confessed to him, dragged him into my messy, emotional world. He had woken up in the clear light of day and realized his mistake and run. The spiral of self-loathing was immediate and vicious. I was a fool, a naive, romantic fool who had mistaken a moment of connection for something more. I had built a fantasy around a quiet Dockhand, and it had all come crashing down. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, heavy weight in my chest. I spent the next 2 hours in a state of anxious misery. I made coffee I couldn't drink. I paced the small cottage like a caged animal. I stared out the window at the docks, but the sea serpent was already gone, out on the water for the day's catch. He was at work. He was moving on with his life, a life that clearly did not include me. The silence in the cottage was deafening, amplifying the frantic, panicked thoughts racing through my head. I replayed every moment from the night before, searching for the clue I had missed, the sign that this was all a terrible mistake. I was just about to give in to despair, to start packing my bags and fleeing Port Blossom and my own humiliation, when there was a quiet, hesitant knock on the door. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. I walked to the door on trembling legs, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. I pulled it open. It was Finn. He was standing on my porch, looking just as tired and uncertain as I felt. He was wearing his work clothes, but they were clean, not the ones he'd left in. In one hand, he held 2 paper cups of coffee from the Salty Siren. He wasn't looking at me, but at a spot just past my shoulder, as if he couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Hi," he said, his voice low and rough. I just stared at him, unable to speak, a war of relief and anger and confusion raging inside me. He finally looked at me, his gray eyes clouded with an emotion I couldn't read. "I had to work," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "The boat leaves at 5. I woke up and it was late. I didn't want to wake you," he took a breath. "But I couldn't. I couldn't work. All I could think about was you here, waking up alone. I told them I was sick. I came back." He looked down at the coffee cups in his hand as if seeing them for the first time. "I brought you coffee." The whole, clumsy, beautiful confession tumbled out of him, and I could feel the knot of panic in my chest begin to dissolve. He hadn't run. He had been thinking of me. He had come back. I stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come in," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He came inside, the small cottage suddenly feeling full again. He handed me one of the cups, his fingers deliberately brushing against mine. This time, the touch was not accidental. It was a question, a reassurance. He held my gaze, and I saw the anxiety there, the fear that he had messed things up. I took the coffee, my fingers lacing with his for a brief, perfect moment. "I thought you regretted it," I admitted, the words tasting like ash. A look of genuine pain crossed his face. "No," he said, his voice firm. "Never. Elias, I'm not good at this. At talking. At morning afters," he gestured vaguely around the room. "I just do things. And leaving this morning was the wrong thing to do. I'm sorry." His apology, so simple and direct, healed the fracture in my heart. I set my coffee down on the counter and stepped into his space, wrapping my arms around his waist and resting my head against his solid chest. I felt his arms come around me, holding me tightly. "It's okay," I murmured into his shirt, which smelled of fresh, clean sea air. "You came back." "I'll always come back," he said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. And in that moment, I believed him. The next few weeks were a strange, wonderful navigation of a new reality. The internal test for me began almost immediately. My lease was ending. The life I had put on pause, the half-finished novel, the empty apartment, the well-meaning friends, was waiting. A part of me, the part that was conditioned for loneliness and self-sabotage, whispered that this was all temporary. A vacation fling. A story I would tell one day. How could this possibly work? He was a man of the sea, tied to this town, this water. I was a man of words, of cities, of transient obsessions. Fear began to creep back in, a cold, familiar fog. I started to pull back, almost unconsciously. I'd get lost in my work for hours, creating a professional distance. I'd hesitate when he reached for my hand in public. I was protecting myself from the inevitable heartbreak, building the walls back up around my heart brick by painful brick. Finn, with his unnerving perception, noticed immediately. He didn't push or demand explanations. He just got quieter, his steady presence becoming tinged with a watchfulness that made me ache. The easy intimacy we had found began to fray at the edges, strained by my own internal conflict. The breaking point came one evening, about a week before I was scheduled to leave. He found me in my bedroom, packing a box of books. I wasn't leaving early, just getting organized, but the sight of the box, a tangible symbol of my departure, hung in the air between us. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched me for a long moment, his face impassive. "You're already leaving," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, tinged with a quiet sadness that was more cutting than any anger. I stopped, a heavy book in my hand. I couldn't meet his eyes. My lease is up next week, Finn. That's not what I mean, he said softly. He was right. I had been leaving for days, retreating emotionally, preparing for the end. I had been so focused on the logistics of our differences that I had failed to honor the reality of our connection. He deserved more than that. He deserved the truth. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice cracking. I finally looked at him, letting him see the fear and confusion in my eyes. It's too good. It doesn't make sense. I live in the city. You live here. I write books. You catch fish. I don't know how to make this work, and I'm terrified of it ending. I think I'm trying to end it first, just to control the fallout. He listened to my whole, rambling, pathetic confession without moving. His expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. When I was finished, he pushed off the doorframe and walked over to me. He gently took the book from my hand and set it on the bed. Then he took my hands in his. You think too much, he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. You're trying to write the ending before we've even finished the first chapter. He looked around the small, temporary room, then back at me. So your lease is up. Don't renew it. I stared at him, confused. What? Don't go back, he said, his voice simple and clear, as if he were stating the most obvious fact in the world. Stay? Stay with me. The offer, so direct, so breathtakingly simple, stole the air from my lungs. Here? In Port Blossom. My cabin's small, he continued, his gaze unwavering. But the couch is bad, remember? You'll have to share the bed. A tiny smile played on his lips. We'll figure it out, Elias. The details. We'll just figure it out. Together. We'll figure it out. It wasn't a grand declaration of love or a promise of a perfect future. It was something better. It was a commitment to the process. It was a belief in us as something worth navigating. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. Tears welled in my eyes, tears of relief and a deep, profound joy. All my complicated fears, all my intricate scenarios of failure, seemed ridiculous in the face of his simple, steady faith. I had been looking for a map, and he was offering me a hand to hold in the dark. Okay, I whispered, a watery, choked sound. Okay. The final scene of my old life played out a week later. I packed the last box into my car, but this time it felt different. I wasn't running from something anymore. I was driving towards something. I drove my things not to the city, but a few hundred yards down the cove, to a small, weathered cabin tucked into a grove of cedars. A few days after that, I was sitting on his porch. My porch. Our porch. My laptop was open on the table beside me, but I wasn't writing. I was watching Finn. He was sitting on the steps, mending a net with that same focused, mesmerizing grace that had captivated me on that first day. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, dappling him in gold. The air was peaceful, filled with the scent of the sea and the quiet, rhythmic sound of his shuttle moving through the mesh. There was no pressure, no tension, just a deep, abiding sense of peace. I got up and went inside, the floorboards creaking familiarly under my feet. I made 2 cups of coffee, just the way he liked it, strong and black. I brought them out and handed one to him. He looked up at me, his gray eyes soft in the warm light, and gave me a slow, genuine smile. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I sat down on the step beside him, our shoulders touching. We didn't speak. We just sat there, sipping our coffee, watching the sun begin its slow descent towards the horizon, painting the water in strokes of orange and pink. The world felt quiet and right. I thought about my book, about my search for something authentic. I had come here looking for a story, for inspiration. I had been looking for it on the page, in my head. But it wasn't there. It was here, in this quiet moment. It was in the solid warmth of the man beside me. It was in the shared silence, the comfortable rhythm of a life beginning to intertwine with another. It was in the reliability of his knots, the steadfastness of his heart. Love wasn't a dramatic plot twist or a flowery declaration. It was a quiet, steady presence. It was a hand reaching out in a storm. It was someone who came back for you. It was someone who saw you, truly saw you, and said, simply, stay. I leaned my head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. He leaned his head against mine in return. The net lay forgotten in his lap. He had tied off all the loose ends. We were secure. I wasn't adrift anymore. I was home.